Sodium laureth sulfate, PEG 150 distearate, polyquaternium 7, tetrasodium EDTA, sodium lauryl amphoacetate, methylparaben, butylparaben, phenoxyethanol, polypropylene terephthalate. This reads like a recipe for a chemical cocktail, but in fact, these are the ingredients for my baby's bath soap.
One day, our ancestor, Homo erectus, discovered fire.
Huh? Well, what do you know? Fire!
Ingeniously, he used it for light. For heat. And for barbecue chicken.
Yum!
The news spread quickly. Soon we were baking clay, smelting ore. Humankind had fearlessly embarked on the road to progress. Today, thanks to human ingenuity, over 100,000 new chemicals synthesized in laboratories fashion the world we live in. We've introduced these amazing molecules into our environment without really considering whether nature would be able to recognize them and break them down. In our short-sighted rush to progress, we never imagined that some of these molecules would one day work their way into living organisms.
These test tubes contain umbilical cord blood. We've analyzed thousands of them and found pollutants such as heavy metals, organochlorine pesticides, PCBs, and that means that the mother was exposed to these pollutants and transmitted them through her bloodstream to her unborn child.
Progress is merciless. After Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, we now have Homo toxicus.
No thought was really given to the health effects, maybe even outside acute effects on workers. I mean, if something was killing someone in a factory, you might slow down the production of it. But once it was out into the environment, there were no laws, there were no regulations, there were no thresholds, and that is largely true today. I mean, one of our toughest talking points, both with reporters and with regular people, they just can't believe these chemicals aren't regulated, but they're not.
A lot of these chemicals are post-war creations, so they entered commerce in the aftermath of World War II, at a time when safety testing requirements just didn't really exist. So these chemicals have been in consumer products for decades, and a lot of them are hormone-disrupting chemicals. Once they're in our bodies, they mimic estrogen or testosterone, and they trigger all of the biological processes that hormones trigger.
We have found over 200 toxic chemicals in the umbilical cord blood of babies. So you're polluted before you're born. Some of those chemicals were banned 30 years ago, and they're still showing up in newborns today. So we have this incredibly disturbing legacy of pollutants that stick around for a long time. They're toxic. They get into our blood. And on top of that, we have a flood of new chemicals and uses of those chemicals in consumer products day in and day out that we're exposed to.
All around us are the products of modern chemistry. All are made of or covered with something that came out of a test tube.
For instance, if you wanted to go to a chemist and say, look, I want to have a chemical, say a pesticide, which will persist throughout the food chain, and I don't want it to have to renew it very, very often. I'd like it to be relatively non-destructible. And then he'd put 2 benzene molecules on the blackboard and add a chlorine here and a chlorine that. And that was DDT.
When the 8th Army needed Jap civilians to help them out in our occupation, they called on native doctors to administer DDT under the supervision of our men to stem a potential typhus epidemic. Dusting like this goes a long way in checking disease, and the labs are them. Pardon our dust.
As the petrochemical era grew and grew, warning signs emerged that some of these chemicals could pose hazards. The data initially were trivial, anecdotal, but gradually a body of data started accumulating to the extent that we now know that the synthetic chemicals which have permeated our workplace, our consumer products, our air, our water, produce cancer and also birth defects and some other toxic effects. Furthermore, industry has known about this, at least most industries have known about this, and have attempted to trivialize these risks. We are now in the midst of a major cancer epidemic, and I have no doubt, and I have documented the basis for this, that industry is largely responsible for this overwhelming epidemic of cancer, in which 1 in every 2 men get cancer in their lifetimes, and 1 in every 3 women get cancer in their lifetimes.
Well, somehow we have industrial chemicals floating around in our bodies. You'd think one of those would be enough, but 232? It's kind of hard to say what's going on.
I don't want to take the chance of buying something that could be really bad for my family.
Well, that's the game. Chances are you bought them already.
I'd struggled with fertility and repeated miscarriages. And as I searched for an answer to why I was having such a hard time carrying a baby to term, I discovered the connection between our environment, our toxic exposures, and our health, particularly our reproductive health.
What we don't know can really hurt us, and there's a lot that we don't know.
80% of the common chemicals in everyday use in this country we know almost nothing about.
From our own studies, we've tested 200 people, we found 482 chemicals, and there are 15,000 chemicals out there in heavy use. How many are showing up in our blood? How many of them might pose a risk?
We have no idea what the long-term health implications of these results are. And I do not want my son or anyone's children to be our scientific experiment.
The American people expect that all chemicals used in the American economy are safe. But, Mr. Chairman, the 30-year-old law that gives EPA that authority is outdated.
Chemicals are part of our daily lives. They are everywhere. In our personal care products, cosmetics, toys, cars, furniture, food packages, IT equipment, electrical appliances, everywhere. Consumers strongly believe that chemicals that are on the market have been tested and are safe, but this is far from being true. And a huge majority of chemicals that are on the market have never undergone any risk assessment. Some of them may cause allergies, or cancer, or obesity, or disrupt your hormonal system. Now this is a problem for all consumers, But this is especially a problem for elderly people, for young children, for babies, and for pregnant women. And studies have shown that there are already hundreds of chemicals in the blood of newborn babies. We have particular concerns with endocrine disruptors. Those are chemicals that disrupt your hormonal system and can lead to problems of fertility, to cancers, early puberty, and obesity. Now, those substances can be really harmful and they can have long-term effects even at a low dose.
There are hundreds of chemicals in the environment that are coming from products that we are using every day, and these chemicals were declared safe dozens of years ago, and now we understand that they can disrupt the endocrine system, the controlling system of our bodies.
Well, our hormone systems are very complex, and everybody must understand it goes beyond the usual sex hormones. There are a lot of hormones. Insulin is a hormone. I don't think most people understand that. And we have an epidemic of diabetes and obesity, all connected, in the Northern Hemisphere, that now, basically, some of the most recent studies, and even a human study, showed a link between a very commonly used plastic called bisphenol A and diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular problems.
What we used to think was that we could use high-dose testing to predict what's going to happen at low levels. That's how all regulatory toxicology works. We used to think that that was sufficient. But that was before we began to realize that some contaminants, like bisphenol A, behave like hormones. And the people that study hormones, endocrinologists, have known for years that what happens at high doses isn't necessarily the same as what happens at low doses. So all of a sudden, as toxicology is confronted with this new way of looking at chemical action, they have to throw out one of their most basic assumptions, that the dose makes the poison.
The numbers are so small that they're beyond the comprehension of most people. That's how small they are. So you think of a part per thousand, a part per million, a part per billion, a part per trillion. A natural hormone, below a part per trillion, it can stimulate breast cancer cells to grow. And now we are seeing chemicals like bisphenol A that are what hard, clear plastic is made out of, and the lining of cans is made out of. It can stimulate breast cancer cells at below a part per trillion, just like the natural hormone.
We're just beginning to understand that chemistry. That chemistry operates in the range of parts per trillion and parts per billion, which industry has told us for years. It's harmless. Concentrations like that are unimportant. But when you interrupt a vital system, something that's developing where these eggs are splitting and developing and budding and forming legs and arms and duct systems and glands, at a part per trillion, these are very dangerous chemicals.
The easiest concept for people to remember is that this hand and the fin of a dolphin and the wing of a bat, at the early embryo stage, they look identical. And inside of the wing of a bat and inside of the fin of the dolphin is a hand. So at the beginning of development of a fish or a frog or a mouse or a human, the early stages of development that are disrupted by endocrine disruptors and the genetic mechanisms are almost identical. We end up looking different, but don't let that deceive you. The mechanisms of development are very, very similar, and the disruption events of development lead to diseases in all of these species. We have proven that in animals, if you expose during the time that you start out, your body starts out as one single cell and then becomes 2 cells and 4 cells and many cells. And we know that as one cell is becoming many other cells, the hormones that control that, if you disrupt them, then you permanently alter the genes in the new cells. And when you do that at the beginning of life, those cells and all of the cells that come from them are defective. And the consequence is that, for instance, after puberty, when the reproductive system starts forming, abnormalities in the organs that after puberty begin to develop, like the female uterus, suddenly you start to see diseases of that organ. You don't see the disease in a child because the uterus is not functioning yet.
So not just one system. This could be the development of the brain, which basically the brain at that time is getting programmed for how an individual is going to develop later in life as well. So their behavior is being affected. Intelligence could be affected.
My involvement in the whole pesticide issue was sort of a surprise as well when I was approached by the largest chemical company in the world, and they asked me if I would evaluate how atrazine affected amphibians or my frogs. Turns out atrazine is the largest selling product for the largest chemical company in the world. It's the #1 contaminant of groundwater, drinking water, rainwater. In 2003, after my studies, it was banned in the European Union, but in that same year, the United States EPA re-registered the compound. We were a bit surprised when we found out that when we exposed frogs to very low levels of atrazine, 0.1 parts per billion, that it produced animals that look like this. These are the dissected gonads of an animal that has 2 testes, 2 ovaries, another large testis, more ovaries, which is not normal, even for amphibians. In some cases, in other species like the North American leopard frog, we showed that males exposed to atrazine grew eggs in their testes, and you can see these large yolked up eggs bursting through the surface of this male's testes. What we proposed and what we've now generated support for is that what atrazine is doing is wreaking havoc, causing a hormone imbalance. Normally the testis should make testosterone, the male hormone, but what atrazine does is it turns on an enzyme, the machinery, if you will, aromatase, that converts testosterone into estrogen. And as a result, these exposed males lose their testosterone, they're chemically castrated, and they're subsequently feminized because now they're making the female hormone. Now this is what brought me to the human-related issues, because it turns out that the #1 cancer in women, breast cancer, is regulated by estrogen and by this enzyme aromatase. So when you develop a cancerous cell in your breast, aromatase converts androgens into estrogens, and that estrogen turns on or promotes the growth of that cancer so that it turns into a tumor and spreads. In fact, this aromatase is so important in breast cancer that the latest treatment for breast cancer is a chemical called letrozole, which blocks aromatase, blocks estrogen, so that if you develop the mutated cell, it doesn't grow into a tumor. Now, what's interesting is, of course, that we're still using 80 million pounds of atrazine, the #1 contaminant in drinking water, that does the opposite, turns on aromatase, increases estrogen, and promotes tumors in rats, and is associated with tumors, breast cancer in humans. What's interesting is, in fact, the same company that sold us 80 million pounds of atrazine, the breast cancer promoter, now sells us the blocker, the exact same company. And so I find it interesting that instead of treating this disease by preventing exposure to the chemicals that promote it, we simply respond by putting more chemicals into the environment.
Our modern environment now includes over 80,000 synthetic chemicals, with around 1,000 new ones being created every year. More than 500 of these are known to cause cancer or to disrupt the hormones in the body. Of the substances that are strongly linked to breast cancer, many are chemically similar to estrogen. Estrogen is a natural hormone that promotes female characteristics, and our cells recognise it by its phenyl ring. However, many synthetic chemicals also hold these phenyl rings. This can cause them to have estrogen mimicking effects. These estrogen mimics can cause problems by taking the place of natural estrogen and turning effects on or off in the cells at the wrong times. Because of this hormone disrupting effect, the estrogen mimics are classed as endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. Importantly, these chemicals aren't only found in factories or behind laboratory doors, as they are all around us in our environment and everyday products. You can find EDCs in many toiletries, detergents, plastic containers, and many other sources.
I tell my college students, because I'm a professor, that the men in this class probably have half the amount of sperm in their testes than I do. Can you imagine? I am 3 times their age, and I am more than twice the man they are.
New science is raising some scary questions. Is fertility declining, especially among men? Back in the 1990s, a controversial Danish study painted a dire picture that suggested sperm counts were falling at such a rapid rate that there would be almost no sperm left in 50 years.
Is there really this 50% decline in 50 years in male sperm counts? Big deal. So I was skeptical.
Skeptical, but still intrigued. Swan decided to do her own test. She came up with the same results as the Danish researchers. Then she looked at the sperm counts of men in Missouri, New York, Minnesota, and California.
The men in central Missouri had about half as many moving sperm.
Swan had a theory about what was going on. Could it be chemicals in the environment?
There are 80,000 chemicals in commerce, and most of them have not been tested. There's no question that pesticides can reduce sperm count. The question is, how much do you need to do the damage?
Last year, Swan looked at another population, university and college-aged males in Rochester, New York. Men just like these swimmers, considered to be at their physical peak, their prime of life.
And what did you find? First of all, that their sperm quality was not great. 23% of the men had counts, which would be grounds for going for seeing an infertility doctor.
But some scientists say we're worrying about the wrong thing. Perhaps it's not the quantity of sperm that counts.
What you do have to worry about is the quality of the sperm.
Dr. Keith Jarvie says it can be a game of chance.
I mean, I have guys coming in with 2 or 3 million sperm. They have kids. Someone who looks very similar, sitting opposite me with 20 or 25 million sperm, having difficulty having children. So there's something about the sperm that we can't necessarily measure. It's basically Las Vegas. If you have more sperm, you're more likely to roll good dice.
When a man orgasms during sex, millions of microscopic tadpole-like organisms swim for their lives, with one goal in mind, to fertilize a waiting egg. But only the strongest swimmer will make it to its destination. Sometimes there may not be any sperm in the ejaculate, or the sperm may not be swimming in a straight line. That's called a motility problem. Other times their shape just isn't right. That's a morphology problem. Then there's the biological clock. Men have one too. It just ticks a little differently. As women age, their supply of eggs dwindles drastically. In men, the sperm is still there. but the quality changes. They don't move as fast, they're the wrong shape, and more of the DNA is damaged.
There has been studies showing that when the father is older and the mother is young, the incidence of autism and the incidence of schizophrenia is higher. Some studies are only 1.5 times higher, other studies are up to 4 or 5 times higher.
But regardless of the potential risks, medical science has turned its attention to solving the problem of the endangered male.
One thing that we do know for certain is that there are certain forms of male infertility that by their very presence we know that they will be transmitted to the offspring.
It's long been known cancer can rob a man of his fertility. But what if you flip that equation? What if infertility was a sign, a marker that a man might be more likely to develop cancer? New research suggests infertility may only be the first health battle men will fight.
We can say with absolute certainty that amongst the risk factors that we count for testis cancer, infertility is absolutely one of them.
How high of a risk? 3-fold. Dr. Thomas Walsh has published studies on the possible links between infertility and cancer. And testis cancer wasn't the only risk, according to a 2010 study.
Specifically, those men who were infertile and had abnormal semen quality were about 2.5 times more likely to develop high-grade, so clinically significant prostate cancer, and that their infertility was preceding their development of prostate cancer by 5 to 10 years.
Not only does infertility appear to increase the risk of prostate cancer, but the kind that could be deadly. It's another level at which doctors are just beginning to understand infertility and its potential consequences.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor? Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question. The brand named most was Camel. Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
This new insect destroyer contains a lot of DDT. Its DDT content is even higher than government specifications. Ideal for vertical surfaces, on fruit and vegetable stands, in cupboards, and it's perfect for ridding Fido of those unwelcome house guests.
This contemporary home shows how modern asbestos materials can be adapted to any style or design. Notice how the asbestos cement sidewalls help add dignity and charm.
Oh, it is attractive.
Yes, and it'll stay that way, too. That's what I like about it.
Fred Vomsal of the University of Missouri and Don Tillett of the U.S. Geological Survey live and work in the nation's heartland. Alarmed by rising numbers of wild animals found with bizarre developmental and reproductive problems, they've joined a national effort to find the cause. The prime suspects include pesticides, the residue of birth control pills and other drugs in treated wastewater, and a compound found in many familiar plastics, bisphenol A.
The problem with chemicals such as bisphenol A is it breaks out of the plastic and leaches into water.
Studies show that from water, this chemical can get into animals. And there it can act like a dose of the female sex hormone estrogen. Too much estrogen can disrupt the endocrine system, and that's been linked to a wide range of health impacts, including gender bending. One critical unanswered question is at what level of exposure these effects occur. With bisphenol A, we're talking about extremely small quantities of this chemical getting into the environment. Samples drawn from this stream had only 30 parts per trillion. Vomsal is worried because studies show tiny amounts of bisphenol A can derail early cell development in mice. And if mice are vulnerable, might people be as well? Recently, Vomsal tested clear plastic baby bottles to see if they release bisphenol A. He devised the simplest of experiments. Let distilled water sit in brand new bottles for 24 hours and then test it. Every one released bisphenol A. Curious, he then decided to see what happens when the same baby bottles are run through an ordinary dishwasher, which heats them to 140 degrees.
Some of these bottles, by the time we had washed them 10 times, were leaching 10 times more bisphenol A than they had before they had been washed.
The plastics industry vigorously disputes any danger to children from the chemical. They cite the continued blessing of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. But the Japanese are cutting back in their use of bisphenol A, and recent independent studies have motivated the FDA to take a fresh look.
I think we're only just beginning to realize how important that cocktail effect is. It's extremely difficult to study, it's expensive, time-consuming, but what the animal studies, very carefully conducted animal studies, have shown is that when you take these chemicals at levels at which individual chemicals have no effect, then together they can have big effects. And again, the effects that we're talking about that have been studied so far are on male reproductive development, so they will include this time window of vulnerability. And the implications of that are enormous, because it means that when you look at one chemical that we may be exposed to low levels of, and which is, you may think this will have no effect, you can't look at it like that. You must say, what else are you exposed to, and how will those add up?
So you move in a what we call dose additive way from no effect on each of the chemicals to combining them and having a very large effect. So I think it's something that everyone is familiar with. If you go to the doctor, your doctor says, what else are you taking before I prescribe this, right? But we don't do that with the chemicals.
I would say, quite frankly, we should be more worried about these health effects. They are going to be more imminent in terms of human society and humankind and all living organisms on Earth than the threat of climate change. It's going to get us sooner.
Every generation before our generation was not living as long as we are living and not as healthy as us. And now what we are seeing is the younger generation with tremendously higher incidence of cancer, of obesity, of diabetes, of neurologic disorders, of brain and behavioral abnormalities, of immune disorders. All of these are caused by environmental endocrine disruptors. And the incidence of all of these diseases in our children are much higher than in my generation.
Well, with what I know today about the extensive misuse of chemistry on a global scale, I cannot conjure up good dreams for the future. I have only bad dreams. Yet I want the world to be cleaner and to be kinder to each child that is born. I often wonder what makes me keep digging. I'm going to cry with it. But I also realize that in the process of dehumanizing mankind with man-made chemicals, we are also producing individuals who will never understand the need to protect what is natural, to protect our life support systems. Individuals who will never see the beauty and the mystery in the birth of a new baby or the bursting forth of foliage in a food crop in the springtime. Despite these dire thoughts, more and more, though, I see parents who are concerned about their health and the health of their children. And women especially are trying desperately to find out what is safe and what will not harm the babies they are carrying in their wombs and their children already there in their homes. There is also hope that deep within everyone, there is something bigger and stronger than we are aware of at this time that cannot be suppressed by man-made chemicals. Something that will prompt some very exceptional leadership to step forward with the courage to turn off corporate control of the government and the world and take back for society what it needs to thrive.